And picking up the torch as the campaign chairman of the American Foundation for AIDS Research.
Use red, nobody's dead.
We'll have red products, we'll have red phones.
Last year we raised over $1 million, we were very happy, and now it's grown immeasurably over the last year.
Members of the public often notice the celebrities who have suddenly and inexplicably become experts on public health. We have turned these kinds of stars into authorities on things way beyond their own training and their own knowledge.
Science, with its harsh efforts at total objectivity, can actually hold within its ways of operating the seeds of its own failure.
At least they should open up the field to people with other theories, because their own has proven to be such a resounding failure.
In science, we cannot have any prejudice. The fact that AIDS started in the gay community has nothing to do with the sexual preferences that this group of people have.
Why do they not acknowledge the virtual immunity of women in the United States and Europe and developed countries?
I think that we've been basically chasing the wrong paradigm for the last 20 years, and I'm afraid to say that it doesn't look like that's going to change anytime soon.
They'll backtrack a little bit, but they'll never give HIV up.
We should continue as combatively as we can to speak out and shake up the dogma at all levels.
The next generation of younger doctors is going to now be able to see all the information before them.
We are told that the most lethal epidemic of the last 100 years is AIDS. That around the world you hear figures as high as 250 million people could be infected. Millions dying. In South Africa alone, 5 million infected. What is the truth of this? We're also told that you need the drugs. They'll put time on your side. Without them, you're absolutely going to die. We're told that once you're infected, it's going to be there forever. You can't get rid of it. Is that the truth? We're also told that we need an antibody test. That's the only way to determine, do we have AIDS? Is that factual? I'm Gary Null. I'd like to welcome you to a special program, a program that will look at AIDS from a different point of view.
The old paradigm in science is first you find the cause and then you treat the cause. Well, with AIDS, we have violated both.
Not a single retrovirus has been ever demonstrated to be responsible for any single human disease, and certainly not killing anybody.
To think that the collapse of the human immune system, which is a very sophisticated system that's built up over millions of years, just started happening in 1980? I'm sorry, this is science fiction.
Dr. David Rasnick is one of the developers of protease inhibitors, part of the antiretroviral drug treatment commonly used to treat AIDS patients. Over the past 26 years, Dr. Rasnick has done extensive research on the subject of HIV and AIDS.
The best evidence against the HIV hypothesis is that there is no evidence for it. In the vast scientific medical literature, over 100,000 journals published so far on HIV/AIDS, we cannot find anywhere in this vast literature the evidence that HIV causes AIDS, that AIDS is a contagious disease, or that it even sexually transmitted. We don't know the names of these people who have done this work. For example, if this had been shown that AIDS is caused by HIV, we should know who these benefactors of humanity are by name. These would be candidates for the Nobel Prize.
In 1983, a French virologist named Luc Montagnier published a paper in which he hypothesized that a virus he had isolated was the cause of the mysterious new syndrome affecting gay men known as acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS. 1 year later, Dr. Robert Gallo at the National Cancer Institute made world headlines after he claimed he had discovered the virus that causes AIDS, using a sample he had borrowed from Luc Montagnier. Dr. Gallo also claimed that he had devised a test for the virus and could reproduce it in the large quantities needed for further research. The worldwide convention that HIV is the cause of AIDS dates from this moment. More than 20 years ago, Dr. Peter Duesberg, a noted molecular biologist, world-renowned virologist, and UCLA professor, was one of the few voices in the world of AIDS dissidents. Around 1987, he began asking a question that seemed like heresy in its day. Was it possible that the scientists were all wrong when they equated HIV with AIDS?
I know Gallo, and Gallo is not a bad virologist. He would have found a virus that is there at concentrations where it could cause a disease. But Gallo proved to the scientific world with this, what proved to be nearly a scandal in the scientific history. He claimed the virus from a colleague as his own. He proved that it was very, very difficult, even for an excellent laboratory as Gallo was operating it at the NIH, to isolate a virus from an AIDS patient.
There has never been viremia, which means the blood flooded with whole cell-free infectious viruses. If HIV were actually doing anything, making people sick, there would indeed be viremia, meaning millions of whole viruses per milliliter of plasma. In fact, nobody has ever observed even one of them.
Some of the most vocal critics of the HIV equals AIDS hypothesis are a group of Australian researchers led by Dr. Eleni Papadopoulos-Eliopoulos. In their breakthrough report, the scientists raised serious questions about the accuracy of HIV antibody tests, and more importantly, the very relationship of HIV to AIDS. In fact, they question whether HIV has ever been isolated.
As far as we're concerned, if one goes through all the HIV literature which exists to date, I think one will find it bold and incredible to still believe that there is proof for the existence of HIV. When a particle looks like a retrovirus, you have to isolate it, then put it in another culture, show that the cells in the secondary culture produce particles exactly like the particles from which they originated. That the two particles from the two cultures are exactly the same can be shown only by determining their constituent proteins and RNA. So isolation is extremely important to prove that a particle is a retrovirus.
From the very start, the hypothesis that the hypothetical HIV was destroying a subfamily of human lymphocytes was making no scientific sense whatsoever, because retroviruses are fundamentally not cytolytic, as we say in medicine. They are not destroying the cells they infect. They coexist with them.
Nobody can find free infectious HIV virus in a human being. That is why they have to resort to looking for antibodies to HIV in a person. That is one of the biggest flaws in the HIV hypothesis, that antibodies, which are a sign of immunity, you should be happy that you have antibodies. It means that you are now immune. And yet with AIDS, we have antibodies as a predictor or an indicator of AIDS and future death.
Retroviruses don't really have much power to cause harm. We have studied retroviruses, but HIV in particular has never been clearly defined in terms of its genetic structure and its molecular structure. And what I mean by that is that you can try to determine the genetic sequence of HIV from one person and compare it to another person, or even different viruses in the same person's body, and you'll find that there are huge variations in their genetic sequences. And now we're starting to talk about different strains and mutations and all this stuff. What that really means is that nobody's really sure exactly what HIV is, what the exact genetic sequence is.
The long latent period is an unambiguous indication that this virus cannot be the cause of AIDS. Unless, of course, that he always say in science, unless we find totally new things, radically new properties in HIV that we haven't found in any other virus or in any other retrovirus. But look at this. Here we have books like this on retroviruses. We have an encyclopedic knowledge on retroviruses accumulated in the last 20 or 30 years. We know hundreds and thousands of them, and so well, better than any other virus. And not one of them does that. There's no way that this virus could have a mystery that isn't in any of these books yet.
If you really sit down and look at HIV research and all the findings that have been presented over the years, you still find no demonstrable qualitative or quantitative activity. Those are scientific words that basically mean we can't find either enough of the type of the virus or enough of it to explain what we then see with the decline of the immune system. There is no real relationship, if you really get down to brass tacks and look at the fine details, which I and others have done, between the amount of HIV in a person's system and whether they get sick or not, or how fast they get sick.
HIV has never been isolated directly from one single AIDS patient. Some pictures, some electron microscope pictures were taken in cell cultures, highly contaminated with a variety of other cells just to make sure that some retroviruses would be found in them. But this was never demonstrated as originating from a single AIDS patient.
There is this notion that HIV jumped from a chimpanzee to a human sometime in the 40s or 50s in Africa. The problem is they've never been able to isolate that previous strain in the chimpanzee. Where is the pre-human version of HIV? It ain't there. They cannot find any animal carrier or any animal reservoir for HIV in the wild. It seems to have been in humans quite some time. And as a matter of fact, Jonas Salk, a very famous scientist who developed the polio vaccine, told me and others in 1994-95, before he passed away, that he probably thinks that HIV was 900 years old in humans, and other researchers have basically postulated even longer.
California microbiologist Dr. Kary Mullis was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1993 for his development of one of the most widely used current techniques in molecular biology today, the PCR, or polymerase chain reaction. This revolutionary technique allows scientists to take a sample containing a very minute amount of DNA and replicate that DNA sequence until there are many copies. One of the first applications of PCR was to analyze human tissue for the presence of HIV. PCR is commonly used in medical and biological research labs for the detection of virus culture in infectious persons.
The people that are AIDS researchers now are getting neurotic if you ask them any questions. There was a time when I first started asking questions, all I wanted was, where are the papers? Just tell me the papers that you read that convinced you that HIV was the cause of AIDS, because I need to reference those papers in some of the, I was working on a test for HIV with PCR, and I needed to write a little report to the NIH to say, here's the progress we've made, and the first line of it was, HIV is the probable cause of AIDS. And I thought that was true. This is before I got involved. And I said, what's the reference for that quote? And I looked for it for about 2 or 3 years, and I never could find it. And by the end of 2 years, I'd ask everybody at every meeting that I'd gone to that talked about AIDS, I'd ask, I'd look through every computer database. There is no reference. There is nobody who should get credit for that statement. And that's a pretty weird situation in science, where getting credit for a discovery is the most important thing in your life as a scientist.
It's not just Peter Duisberg or some outsiders who criticize the failure of our war against AIDS. It's the orthodoxy itself. They advertise they have not saved one single life. That means in conventional scientific logic there could very well be something profoundly wrong with the basic hypothesis, with the basic approach that we use against AIDS.
It wasn't a plot, it wasn't even greed or anything like that. It was a mistake in certain circumstances that happened, but the failure has been that science failed to correct that error. Subsequently, it's had plenty of opportunity to do that, but the whole kind of bandwagon that got rolling.
This year, an estimated 40,000 individuals in the United States and almost 6 million people worldwide will become infected with HIV.
With all the feeling associated with it, the compassion for AIDS patients, the fear of what was happening as this purported virus was thought to be spreading sexually in the world's populations, that feeling, that emotion, stopped science from following its normal checks and balances and putting right this fundamental mistake.
After 20 years of research, with nothing on the vaccine horizon, pretty inconsistent treatments, and no actual mechanism by which we are to understand this tiny little piece of genetic material causes the complete collapse of the immune system, I think it's high time that we started looking at other alternatives. Not to say that HIV has nothing to do with AIDS, but there probably is something going on, and some of the biggest minds in AIDS science are beginning to suspect this as well.
This is Stonewall. This is where it began. June 28, 1969. 8 New York City police officers showed up here. They came to do what they had done dozens of times, arrest and harass gays. A major confrontation ensued. Within 2 hours, there were nearly 2,000 gays in the street and 400 New York City police. The New York City police realized that it could no longer arbitrarily and capriciously harass and attack individuals who were simply choosing to honor their own lifestyle. This was the beginning of gay liberation. It was also the beginning of the sexual revolution within the gay community. And within the next few years, hundreds of clubs like Stonewall would open throughout New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. From the mid-1970s until 1984, when the so-called official cause of AIDS was announced to the world, many individuals in the gay community were suffering from a unique form of diseases that baffled scientists. The original theory was that living an unhealthy lifestyle, including the use of poppers or amyl nitrate and unsafe anal intercourse, were the causes of AIDS.
After years of struggling for their sexual predisposition to be accepted by society, with the whole gay lib movement and everything that stood for, here was what was at first called a gay plague by the US administration in the early 80s. They were more or less saying, we wash our hands of this, and that presented a very big threat to these guys because they knew that their friends were dying, that there was a genuine new syndrome there, and the government was seemingly not showing much interest.
The name was suggested for that disease to name it gay-related immune deficiency, GRID. So it was strictly associated with the fact that these 5 initial patients were homosexuals. That created an extremely passionate reaction from the gay community that regarded as totally intolerable that such a discrimination was pointing at their lifestyle and the disease.
AIDS was first identified among gay men in 1981 who practiced certain lifestyle behaviors. They, according to New York Times, on July 3rd, 1981, tended to have upwards of 2,000 sexual contacts a year and used a lot of aphrodisiacal drugs, including poppers, amyl nitrite, a very dangerous substance that gay men had been inhaling in epidemic proportions since the early 1970s. And with regard to the sexual activity, you don't need to be moralistic to say that, gosh, you have 2,000 sex partners a year, you develop a laundry list of infectious diseases, venereal diseases, that can do a lot of damage over the long term to your immune system. Doctors and scientists looking at this phenomenon early on said, gosh, they do a lot of drugs, they have a laundry list of venereal diseases. The combination of these factors might well be enough to knock their immune systems for a real loop.
In addition to the drug use and anal intercourse, gay men suffered from AIDS typically practiced other immune suppressive habits such as drinking and smoking, intravenous drug use, very unhealthy diets, and a gross lack of sleep. This combination of hazardous lifestyle choices is often referred to as fast tracking. And while found primarily in the gay community, certain aspects of the fast track can be also seen among heterosexuals.
Now, the lifestyle hypothesis has been around a while, And the reason, of course, it hasn't really been taken seriously by the medical establishment is there's not really any one thing that you can point to actually work on, to target. And careful epidemiology has now been able to separate some of these things out. So there was obviously a very strong suspicion that these poppers or amyl nitrates were a cause, and I think the good epidemiology work has essentially now ruled that out, because there are aspects of the fast-track gay lifestyle, which include drinking and smoking and various types of sexual activity, that are not correlated with becoming HIV positive and developing AIDS. After all, lots of heterosexuals drink and smoke and do many of the same fast-tracky kind of things that gay men do, and yet they're not dropping dead of AIDS. So there has to be more careful look at the epidemiology to get past the lifestyle label. Because to many, of course, that's seen as a homophobic condemnation of a whole lifestyle that's not actually scientifically or medically supported. We have to look at the individual aspects of lifestyle. Is there one of these lifestyle factors, gonorrhea, syphilis, tanning salons, poppers, that is far more associated with both becoming HIV positive and then later dying? And the answer is yes. Syphilis has been correlated as the most prominent prior condition associated with becoming HIV positive more than any other single condition, and this was proven by a large U.S. Army study conducted and published in 1992, which showed you were 40 times more likely to become HIV positive if you had syphilis than if you hadn't. A similar study in Amsterdam showed the same thing.
Dr. Stephen Kaeza started his private practice in Manhattan in 1982, primarily treating gay men. Kaeza quickly noticed an increase in the number of cases of gonorrhea and herpes, while seeing a relatively small level of cases of syphilis by comparison. He found the low incidence of syphilis among his patients very odd, considering their lifestyle. This is an excerpt from an interview I did with Dr. Kaeza on my radio show around 1990.
After working for several years with these patients, there was something more than a single entity disease going on. The dogma was one cause, one disease, ultimately one magic bullet. And in my experience, and again from 82 to the present day, I've, for all practical purposes, done nothing but AIDS, I felt that can't be. How could a simple virus, which I believe has only 9 genes, I could be wrong on that, cause such a variety of clinical illnesses? I then began looking for co-infections. The one I came up with, which seems to be the most important and even more important in terms of initially suppressing your immune system than HIV, is of all things syphilis. Now, why then don't we see more syphilis is the obvious question. The answer is we do see it. We're seeing it every day. We're having a true pandemic of syphilis, but because of the presence of HIV, the blood tests that we doctors grew up to believe in don't work. I've been taking all my HIV positive patients, and whether I can find serologic, that is blood evidence of syphilis or not, I'm treating them for syphilis in a rather aggressive way. And quite frankly, I, and apparently no one else, can explain the results I'm getting given orthodox dogma.
So what you're saying is that AIDS as a single virus simply does not exist.
AIDS is a complex disease caused, and state-of-the-art knowledge, and this may change, certainly syphilis, chronic syphilis you don't know you have, that's been on board minimum a year, okay? That's probably 70% of the ball game right there. But you add to that things like, and you made this point very well, Gary, you add herpes to that, and we now know herpes is playing a role in this. It's a 10% role, but 10% is still 10%. HIV is certainly playing a role in this. Again, it's a 10-15% role, but still 10-15%. There may be other things, chlamydia, amoebiasis, lifestyle. Every 10% is going to count. But
it does seem to be quite clear now that if you hit the patient hard and early, I have to emphasize that I can't put together a train wreck. You gotta come early. But if I can get my hands on an infected, but essentially healthy person early, that person will plateau and live a normal life.
Since the official discovery of the AIDS virus in 1984, we've been told that HIV, the virus that is supposed to cause AIDS, is sexually transmitted, and that everyone who was sexually active was at risk.
The risk reduction results remain positive and significant for drug users, for heterosexual populations, and for gay men.
Although the science of AIDS is still very much up in the air, the early work done by the Centers for Disease Control epidemiologists, now I'm talking about the early 1980s, 81, 82, in my view, pretty much proved that something that was passed on through sexual activities was decimating the immune systems of the people who were engaging in these activities. And there has been no evidence that has come along since then to basically dissuade me or my colleagues from that view.
The statistics have been confirmed over and over again, most recently just last year from the University of California at San Francisco, that it takes on average 1,000 sexual contacts with an HIV person or persons in order to become HIV positive yourself. That means 1,000. Put that in comparison with typical sexually transmitted diseases. It takes on average 2 to 3 sexual contacts to get gonorrhea or syphilis, for example. Now, the CDC has estimated a constant 1 million Americans infected with HIV over the past 10 years. Constant number. That right there should be a giveaway. It's not spreading in society.
That's not an epidemic. The number of cases reported went up epidemically, exponentially, because the number of tests that was done went up exponentially. How many doctors knew about HIV in 1983? 2. How many knew about it in 1985? Say 500. How many knew about it in 1986? 40,000. So that's where the curve came from. How many tests were done?
Look at the articles in the literature that talk about sexual transmission of AIDS. I've found at least 15 of them, and in every case they were unable to find sexual transmission of HIV positive at a rate greater than 5 for every 1,000 acts of unprotected intercourse. And in a few of those studies they actually controlled for use and non-use of condoms and found that use of condoms made no difference. This is not a sexually transmitted disease.
The heterosexual epidemic certainly doesn't seem to have materialised in Australia. For example, in 1991, 10 years after AIDS commenced, researchers were able to write that no Australian prostitutes had been infected through sexual intercourse. None.
Prostitute women don't have higher rates of HIV or AIDS than anybody else. And in fact, any research that has been done has also shown a number of other things that indicate that prostitute women are taking very good care of their health and the health of clients and the community in general.
In the MAX study, they have shown the only sexual act directly related to the development of the phenomenon which is called HIV and of AIDS was passive anal intercourse. By 1997, Nancy Padian has proven that AIDS cannot be heterosexually transmitted. They had couples there who either one or the other was positive, and they were followed up for more than 6 years. And although nearly 25% of the couples were not using condoms, still no one of the negative couples ever seroconverted.
in just about every group where you had men and women present, the infection rate of men is 2 or 3 times that of women. AIDS started in the 1980s. There were 95% of AIDS patients were men. Over the years that has changed, and it's now about 3 to 1. So, AIDS has affected men and women differently over the years, and HIV has affected them the same over the years.
In Haiti, they told me they'd followed 780 couples over 8 years. To their amazement, 1 couple was positive and 1 negative, I hasten to add. 750, 8 years? Do you know how many became both positive, concurrent, I think it's called? 36.
If it's just caused by needles, or it's just caused by homosexual activities, you're not going to really get a long, sustained public outcry against it, and nobody's going to want to spend $6 billion a year. They're going to say, well, we really didn't like those people anyhow. Great. I can't think of a better solution to the homosexual problem than a disease that'll kill them all. I mean, there would be congressmen that would talk about that quietly, not on television. So the CDC had to say, we can't say that. We got to say it's got to be heterosexually transmitted. There's no proof that it's transmitted at all at that point. So why not just say, well, it's heterosexually transmitted too? Because that made it a plague, and the CDC needed one. The CDC hadn't had a good plague since polio. Their funding was probably going to be cut back if they didn't come up with one. The guy that was the head of the CDC, in fact, wrote memos that have been obtained, where he describes this as hot stuff. Those guys have got an agenda, which is not what we would like them to have, being that we pay for them to take care of our health in some way.
In 1996, in the Wall Street Journal, a couple of investigative reporters had found that the Centers for Disease Control in the 1980s had hired a public relations firm to campaign along the lines, everyone is at risk of AIDS. And they did that not because they thought everyone was at risk of AIDS, but because they thought if it remains a disease associated with gay men and drug users, we're not going to get any funds to do anything about it.
The religious right liked it because they felt that we'd all been a bit too loose about sex, and now that this virus was out, people would be more careful about sleeping around, and the left liked it because it became a sort of icon of their desire to express their compassion. And virologists loved it because they'd failed to find a virological cause of cancer in President Nixon's war on cancer, and there was a lot of money in that, and they wanted that money to keep rolling. And so this new threat to humanity meant that their community was going to get a lot of money. And the journals loved it. Journals like Science and Nature, their pages have swelled with ads for biotechnological advances, thanks to the some 150 billion of taxpayers' money, US taxpayers' money alone, that's gone into HIV/AIDS research and treatment. So many different constituencies wanted this.
There were people who felt that a single virus theory would be useful in helping raise public awareness about the disease. It would also help them get the research they thought was necessary and public funding for its treatment. By alarming the public into believing that while the disease was affecting principally gay men then, it would soon spread throughout the heterosexual population. This political definition of the disease has proven to be inaccurate and inconsistent with its true medical nature.
To suggest, as was suggested in the mid-1980s, that everyone was equally at risk from AIDS was a lie. And the chief medical expert at the American Foundation for AIDS Research, AMFAR, at the time, Dr. Joseph Sonnabend, quit because he knew it was a lie.
You've had people in the gay community starting to blame other people in the gay community for saying, you had the wrong kind of sex, you didn't wear condoms, you didn't do this, you didn't do that, you got HIV and it's your fault.
So the gay community wanted this to be taken seriously. So they were very pleased when a virus theory was put forward, because it seemed as if that would be a way to democratize this illness. Everybody was going to be at risk of it in time. They'd just been unlucky enough to be hit first.
The same people who in 1990 were saying Peter Duesberg is a homophobe because he says people who use drugs got AIDS, he's blaming the victims for their illness. And now the same people who used to say that are themselves blaming the victims for their illnesses.
I think public health advice that you give to people in the midst of an epidemic has to be grounded in the science. And the science did indicate, and still does, that AIDS as we understand it is definitely something that sexual activity is one of the big risks for.
T cells are a type of white blood cell called lymphocytes, and they play a central role in the body's ability to fight off all kinds of germs and diseases. Now, based upon the theory that HIV piggybacks onto T cells and renders them useless in fighting off infections, T cell counts became increasingly important as an indicator of how far along the disease had progressed. Starting in 1993, in addition to an HIV antibody test, a T cell count below 200 would now be used to diagnose someone as having AIDS.
According to the CDC's own statistics, 65% of patients who've been diagnosed with AIDS in the calendar year of 1997 were diagnosed solely on the basis of having a positive HIV test and low T cell counts.
Certainly, T4 decrease cannot be considered the hallmark of AIDS because it appears in many patients who never develop AIDS. In fact, all you have to do to have a decreased T4 cell is to go on the beach and lie there for a few hours. And if you measure your T4 cells, more than likely they will be very low.
It's not possible to measure the strength of your immune system using the blood. It makes no sense because only 2% of those white blood cells or lymphocytes said to be responsible for immune functions are in the blood. All the others are in the tissues where they have to do their work.
The health infrastructure throughout a whole country.
Security agenda is protecting lives.
Many Americans may not realize
that 25 years of unlimited money being spent on AIDS, and yet there is absolutely nothing serious to show for it.
It's too dangerous for the government to fund basic research, because with government funds comes politics, and politics only permits one view to prevail rather than competing views.
All this money spent, this $1 billion, is not preventing AIDS, not curing AIDS, but making the problem bigger.
Science nowadays, it's no science anymore. It's more about public relation, power, business, industry.
The whole thing might have been based on bogus science.
Why are we spending so much money today on AIDS research? In fact, more than we spend on either cancer or heart disease. Where has all this money gone? And to what benefit? What are the results? What groups of people have found relief? Certainly not those who need it when they enter into research programs seeking some form of improvement or a cure. Is that the reason so many in the gay community are very vocal and organized, gathering at conventions, at open city areas, demanding a release, a cure after all these years?
They're going down a particular path which is leading them nowhere because they're not solving the problems. And all the time the public are saying, where is the magic cure? We've spent millions in this direction. What's happening?
Having created and marketed the HIV story, the US government scientists, Fauci, Gallo, who were primarily responsible for doing this, they needed a drug to go with it because gay men at that Washington AIDS conference, they were demanding, I remember the demonstrators there saying, give us the drugs now. You know, they were really afraid and they really felt that drugs were the answer.
No results. And the establishment themselves obviously realise that they've got to put on a brave confident face. So anyone that attempts to challenge where they're going will get flattened because they're really frightened of showing that the cracks in what they're doing.
So there are very strong pressure groups and interest groups involved with AIDS. There are immunologists and virologists and the pharmaceutical companies who are all trying to find vaccines and antiviral drugs to deal with HIV. And such is the asymmetry of information. The public still believe that it is a general threat, that it's been very difficult for these fundings to be cut back.
After all of this time, who really benefits from the billions and billions of dollars spent each year on AIDS research? There is so much TV coverage. AIDS is good media play, and ratings zoom at the hint of a breakthrough of a new miracle drug. And Hollywood has stepped into the spotlight in support of HIV/AIDS research, yet we're still no closer to finding a cure.
The scientists who started AIDS, they were looking for another disease that they could say that retroviruses cause, and it had to be something infectious. So I think they went into it with a certain mindset. We need an infectious disease because we're retrovirologists, and if we don't have some kind of a disease that goes along with our germs, then we're kind of out of a job.
Scientists are supposed to have some evidence that leads them tentatively to some conclusion or to some action. They're supposed to be able to show that to other scientists, any interested person, in fact, who's willing to understand what it is that was used as evidence, should be able to say, yeah, I agree with that. That makes sense, using rules of inference that we've used since Aristotle.
Those that control and maintain the HIV hypothesis of AIDS are two basic institutions: the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, and the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. Both of these institutions will probably come as a surprise to the public to learn that they are military organizations. When you have these military structures in the CDC and the National Institutes of Health, you can control the debate, you can control the information flow. Not only that, since the National Institutes of Health are the primary source of funding for all academic, medical, scientific research, they can control who gets funding to do what research. And in that fashion, they can control what gets published and, more importantly, what you exclude.
The scientists are, like you say, they are considered the final arbiters of what's good for the planet or what's bad for the planet. And they hadn't got the slightest idea. Instead of wearing white robes, they wear white lab coats, you know. Instead of bringing you the word of God, they bring you the word of the EPA or whatever. And they don't have to understand what it is that they're making you do, in fact. And people, you know, I think they fall naturally into it because there is a need in humanity for something like a religion, something that makes you feel a part of some larger kind of group, something that you think, in spite of your wormy little life, makes you a part of something good, something big.
There's a kind of pathological science, not a deliberate deception, but a sort of sickness that has gripped these great communities, these great professionals. And to take that on board is a big challenge to your sense of your place in the world. I think that's been the biggest factor that in the more recent years has led to this sensitivity about anything that could challenge the HIV theory.
When beliefs get tangled up with facts, matters of fact become matters of religious kind of significance, where if somebody gets mad at you for asking him a question in a scientific meeting, or says, we're never going to have Kary Mullis at the European Union of whatever kind of scientists, or they put it in Nature, because he came in there and had the audacity to tell people that it might not be that bad to have sex, that AIDS might not be something you get from sex, that I don't see any evidence for it, is all I said. I don't see any evidence for it. Why? You can't tell young people that.
The issues that are not being debated in the AIDS problem are the same issues that are not being debated in general across the board when one looks at the interface between biology and medicine. That is to say that what's not being addressed are those agencies out there, those signals in the environment, which are enormously effective in bringing about a disease, those are not being addressed almost anywhere. But what is being addressed is the rather narrower issue of what infectious agents cause diseases.
Disbelief in science is the essence of progress. We don't get anywhere in science by belief. We get anywhere by using data, by elaborating hypotheses, putting them to the test. We shouldn't despise criticism in science. We should welcome it.
There are many scientists that are nowadays working inside the conventional institutions, like in NIH, like in the CDC in Atlanta, like in Pasteur Institute. And many of these scientists are very close to our views. However, why they don't come open? They cannot come open suddenly. Why? Because they will lose their jobs.
Today there are many scientists and physicians working within the conventional institutions who have similar viewpoints to those of the dissidents. Well, why don't they come out? Why don't they speak their minds? Is it possible that they take a look at what has happened when you do question the HIV equals AIDS equals death hypothesis? They've been suppressed. Dr. Peter Duesberg, noted scientist, was the main person in the line of fire.
Peter is a very scholarly person in addition to being brilliant too. He's very careful. He doesn't say anything that he can't support. And also one of the most brilliant people surely the most brilliant virologist.
Peter Duesberg at the University of California, Berkeley campus is seen as someone who is now dangerous. His funding has been cut off. Graduate students are encouraged not to take his courses, and I think his administrative duties have included being in charge of the department picnic.
Look what's happened to Peter Duesberg. He doesn't have a laboratory anymore. That takes away his credibility as a scientist.
My funding, for example, from the National Institute of Health will not be renewed as of this year, and I may be out of business then. Also, my colleagues have essentially excommunicated me. I'm not invited to meetings, or hardly ever to meetings anymore, not ever to one on AIDS. I'm not allowed to publish in the same journals anymore as I used to. Even as a member of the National Academy, I cannot publish in the National Academy my views that drugs may be the cause of AIDS. And I have plenty of evidence to support it, to document my claim, which might be very relevant to the health of millions of Americans and people on this planet. Yet I'm censored because I'm essentially considered to be an outcast or an odd man or somebody who has controversial views.
He was a really well thought of guy too because of his ideas. The whole field, I mean in cancer, he's the guy that led him into the whole oncogene thing, you know. Big research bonanza. Anybody who could order a little kit from some company and hire a couple of technicians could be a cancer researcher because of things that Peter opened up. And then Peter said, no, I don't think that's actually the cause of cancer. And that made those guys a little bit angry. And then he comes along and does the same thing for AIDS. He said, you know, I think we're on the wrong track here.
One of the main problems in the war on AIDS is it's essentially become a battle for, or between truth and power.
If HIV causes anything, boy, if it causes anything, it certainly causes fundraisers, and it raises funds in many different ways.
In Africa, in India, and especially cities like Bombay and Calcutta, in Bangkok, Thailand, with its excessive sex trade, and emerging suburbs and cities in China, Haiti, Guatemala, and Brazil. Impoverished people in these countries around the globe are said to be experiencing an epidemic of HIV and AIDS. Their governments welcome the cash flow that drug companies provide with open arms. The effects of overwhelming poverty, malnutrition, and disease are taking their toll. Many of these poorer nations cannot afford to help their own people and look to their wealthier neighbors for relief. Money pours in from various sources, mostly drug companies, who are offering new drugs for test subjects. The testing is being done in the name of research, but who really benefits?
the pharmaceutical giants like Roche and Abbott and Glaxo Wellcome and so forth. They've made offers to African governments over the last couple of years, particularly to South Africa, to offer these so-called antiretrovirals, which are a controversy in and of themselves, like AZT and the other nucleoside analog drugs, but to make those drugs available at what the pharmaceuticals would consider a cut rate price. What they mean by cut rate would be that an individual's dose would cost about $200 a month. Well, the vast majority of people in Africa don't have a per capita income of $200 a year. So someone is going to have to subsidize these kinds of drugs, making them available in Africa. And I think that the pharmaceuticals will look towards state organizations or multilateral institutions.
So business came in on the story after, in my view, it had been created by these social and political pressures. Once the story got going, and the mega dollars for research and treatment started to flow, then business also became a big player. And the huge profits that were made from the early AIDS drugs, for which a lot of money was charged because there was great fear about this, those profits got fed back into AIDS organizations, gay men's organizations in some instances, activists, and thousands of NGOs actually today owe their existence to these funds.
The doctors are treated very well by the pharmaceutical companies. They're wined and dined at the meetings. The meetings are incredible trade shows. People playing with condoms, pulling them over their heads, blowing condoms up, seeing how much air they could hold. All of this stuff goes on. And there wasn't even a lounge for people with AIDS. There were, at some of the conferences that I've gone to, they put a lounge for people with AIDS at the farthest building from the conference, on the 4th floor, without a couch, without even any water in the room. And they had to be reminded, the conference governors had to be reminded that perhaps you could put some water and some fruit, maybe, and maybe a couch. And their ACTUP had to carry the couch into the room, and then they put guards at the door.
The way to get rid of AIDS is to stop funding it. Just stop everything that's called AIDS research. Somebody tries to get a grant for AIDS research, say, we don't do it anymore. We don't have AIDS. If you want to study pneumocystis carinii, we'll maybe look at your paper and see if you've got something to say about that. You want to study any one of those diseases by itself, try to cure it, we'll talk about that.
At the moment, the pharmaceutical companies are making so much money from antiretroviral drugs, they don't want any investigation into any other possibilities, despite all a mountain of evidence. One way in which they have rather forced the debate is by funding generously organisations which support their point of view. If any organisation has got a highly paid executive and they're receiving huge amounts of money from a pharmaceutical company, most would be pretty stupid to bite the hand that feeds them, because they find the next year, all of a sudden, that funding's disappeared.
So the money pours in from various organizations in the United States and Western Europe and the UN, all in the name of finding a cure for AIDS. The people are desperate for treatment, and they trust the doctors who provide them with medications. Sadly, these people are often used as human guinea pigs for new products that generally do not work, and in many cases may actually make the person worse or even kill them. As long as assistance arrives in the form of pills to treat the symptoms, instead of infrastructure changes that can provide clean water, proper medications for malaria, tuberculosis, schistosomiasis, healthier diets, and an end to political conflict and gross poverty, the death toll will continue to rise. Little wonder the public is fearful of HIV testing. A positive HIV antibody test means that a person will eventually develop AIDS, considered by most to be a death sentence. We're also told that early detection and treatment can prolong your life, and that the HIV antibody test is the most accurate method of detection. However, The scientific literature that comes with the test kit clearly states that the test should not be used to diagnose someone as having the HIV virus. Well, if the test kit's own manufacturer states it should not be used for diagnostic procedures, what then is the value of this test?
There are two tests in common use. One's called the ELISA, the other's called the Western blot. The only difference between them is that in the ELISA test, all the so-called HIV proteins, about 10 of them, are all mixed up together in a solution. And in the Western blot, prior to reacting, the proteins have been separated out into a nitrocellulose strip. Now, the test that really matters in all this is the Western blot. So we really don't need to discuss the ELISA test. It's used as a screening test, and it is admitted by experts that it is not sufficiently specific to diagnose HIV infection, whereas the Western blot, if positive, is considered synonymous with HIV infection.
The standard screening test is an ELISA. Occasionally you get a false positive. Under those circumstances, a Western blot can absolutely confirm. Western blots are also important when you have people, for example, who have been vaccinated in vaccine trials and making antibody against one protein. The only way you're going to tell if they're infected serologically is by looking at a Western blot showing they make antibodies to the other protein. So it has a lot of value. It's fundamentally a confirmatory diagnostic test.
It is nearly impossible to determine the rate of false positives because there is no gold standard to independently verify test results.
Depending on the dilution of the blood sample, basically we are all seropositive. It all depends on the dilution of the sample.
At the moment, there is not a gold standard to know if we have antibodies for the presence or absence of antibodies against HIV-1 or HIV-2 in human blood.
There's also data from a number of hospitals in the US, which was published in 1988, where they tested nearly 90,000 blood samples anonymously. These patients were selected to have no risks for HIV infection or AIDS. In some of the hospitals, they found 25% of men were HIV positive on the Western blot, the most specific test, and they found that 8% of women were HIV positive on the Western blot. I mean, this should lead one to question again, how do that many people who have no risk for HIV or AIDS get to have that many HIV antibodies?
If you imagine that this was a breathalyzer and this was an antibody test. Now, breathalyzers are carefully calibrated by comparing them to alcohol. No HIV test, if you look at the literature that comes with them, has ever been calibrated by comparing it to HIV infection. In fact, the instructions actually say that they presume that the presence of antibodies implies presence of the virus. HIV tests have got a well-documented huge list of over 60 things in medical literature, established medical literature, which shows that these tests are completely non-specific. Now, if breathalyzers were validated on that basis, you'd have people convicted of drink driving with a test which has never been compared properly to alcohol, and which it's known that tea, coffee, fruit juice, cola and milk can produce false positives. You'd never be able to convict anybody of drink driving on that basis, but that's the basis on which people are given a diagnosis of a biological death sentence every day.
The arguments that Peter Duesberg originally made, that antibody is normally a sign of immunity, normally is correct. Antibodies are normally a sign of immunity. And it's highly paradoxical that a virus whose levels in the blood are brought down to undetectable levels following the appearance of antibodies can somehow later on go and kill someone 10 years later. It's a real medical conundrum, and the scientific community has not been responsible in addressing this paradox.
One of the best ways to change from positive to negative is simply to change your residence to a different country. This was published in Continuum magazine from London. It was made up by Val Turner, a scientist in Australia who has done a lot of work on HIV antibody tests. There are different criteria for reading these tests, and each one of these columns shows the different criteria from different countries or places. In Africa, all you need is 2 of these bands to be positive. In Australia, you need 4. In the United States, we have 5 different sets of criteria for reading Western blots, and they are all totally different. So if you go to a lab that uses the American Red Cross criteria, you may be positive. And if you go to a lab that uses the FDA criteria, you may be negative. And if you go to a lab that uses the CDC criteria, you will more likely be positive there because they use much more lax criteria.
I don't think that there's anything wrong with different countries having different criteria, because the different criteria are only really for that small group of patients that come in the indeterminate level. When a Western blot is really positive, it hits you like a truck. It's only for that little indeterminate group that you have to be concerned.
In theory, at least, that if you were tested in New York today, then flew to Australia, and you had 3 bands in New York, you would not be positive in Australia, but you would be positive in New York City. Now, a virus cannot behave in this manner, and this is what has led us to hypothesise that there is no proof that any person with a positive antibody test, no matter how defined, is in fact infected with this so-called lethal retrovirus.
Everybody uses it experimentally, and most people use it clinically around the world. Not, maybe Britain doesn't use it, maybe there are 2 countries that found a better way, God bless them.
When he came up with his first test, he tested 30% of the American blood donors, so let's say the general population, he tested them positive. And the industry said, no, go home, Gallo. We won't buy your test because this is going to destroy our business. And the only thing what he did, he lowered the sensitivity of the antibody test.
If they didn't allow them to charge so much for it, I think there'll be a lot less use of it. You know, it's just like in political scandals. Follow the money trail. Figure out who's getting paid for this. Who's getting the money for those Western blots. There's your person who's going to always come down on the side of, yeah, you got a confirmatory Western blots, they call it. They don't even do them in England anymore.
No, not since 1992.
It's totally, and ask a doctor how it works. The doctor who prescribes it says, got to have a Western blot to confirm this ELISA positive thing. How does that work, doctor? Sir, what are they now measuring about me that's different from what they measured with the ELISA test? He wouldn't know. He's not got any idea. I'll bet you there's scarcely 50 physicians in this country that know what a Western blot really is. They know when to order it, and they know they get a kickback on it probably.
AZT causes diarrhea. AZT causes muscle wasting. It causes a whole host of complications.
AZT causes instant old age.
How do you know which is the disease and which is the effect of the drug?
There were many patients who developed blood toxicities. There were many patients who experienced other symptoms of adverse reactions. Think of all the people who died from what we think was AIDS. Were those people in fact killed by AZT?
Using drugs that are targeted against HIV has been a tragedy, worse than useless. AZT was a terrible drug, and many AIDS doctors will admit that quietly and privately these days. Nobody, in a caring profession like medicine, likes to admit that they may have killed a lot of their patients.
AZT is an antiretroviral drug that became the first drug approved for the treatment of AIDS and HIV infection in 1987. It was originally intended to treat cancer, but it failed to show efficacy and had unacceptably high side effect profiles. However, the unavailability at that time for alternatives to treat AIDS affected the risk-benefit ratio greatly.
The antiviral drugs are chemotherapies. They're all based on chemotherapies that have been developed 30 years ago, long before AIDS was known, to kill human cells. Chemotherapy is restricted to a few months in the hope the cancer dies before you die.
If you started taking any other chemotherapeutic agent for the rest of your life, it would be that agent probably that killed you. When you give chemotherapy to somebody with cancer, you give them a round of it for maybe 14 days or a few days. Hopefully you're not going to kill the patient, you're going to kill the cancer. The patient's going to survive. But you don't keep giving it to him until he dies, because he certainly will.
AZT not only terminates DNA synthesis of all sorts, but it also acts in other ways. It acts in the mitochondria to lead to the oxidation of the mitochondrial DNA in ways which were not suspected. I'm thinking of the work of Miyazawa and Ozawa. it destroys mitochondrial function. And the mitochondria may be the secret to degenerative diseases.
Initially, it was administered in much higher doses than today, typically 300 to 400 milligrams every 4 hours, even during the night. Modern treatment regimens typically use much lower doses, and like other antiretroviral drugs, it is almost always combined with other drugs in what is often referred to as a cocktail or highly active antiretroviral therapy. It is combined with other drugs in order to prevent mutations of the HIV virus into an AZT-resistant form.
A 1,200 milligram dose of AZT originally handed out to patients like candy, and they were desperate to take it, in 88 and 89 and 98 resulted in countless unnecessary deaths. This is proven beyond a doubt by the largest and longest study ever conducted of the drug AZT amongst asymptomatic people, that is, people who have HIV antibody but do not have symptoms yet. That was the Concord trial. And if you actually look up the Lancet publication of that trial, you find that the trial is divided into two groups of people. They're all healthy, they're all HIV positive. The one the group that gets a placebo, a dummy drug that does nothing, and the other group which gets the real thing without telling people. Follow them for 3 years. When you looked at the people who went on the drug right away, in that group of people, there were 169 deaths. In the group of people that waited until symptoms developed to take the drug, there were a scattering of deaths, 2 or 3. Now, I think that's pretty persuasive evidence that that drug is and was harmful.
I've shown that the original drug trials, the phase 2 studies, were blatantly fraudulent, proving nothing. And yet it was the basis for the approval of AZT not only in the United States, but 30 other countries.
During the 3 years that I participated in the early AZT clinical trials, I witnessed the most shocking, unethical, unscientific, and corrupt behavior by the clinicians conducting these studies. Whenever there was an adverse reaction, such as diarrhea, or weight loss, or night sweats, or vomiting, or fevers, or the development of an opportunistic infection, this information was supposed to have been recorded on an as-needed form. Often these things were not recorded.
Was it possible that drug companies knew that their trials were misleading, that people were getting hurt by drug trials that produced no positive results?
The original research for AZT said that it killed infected cells at a rate 1,000 times greater than healthy cells. But there are now 4 papers after that original one, which is also a Gallo-Bolognese paper, this one, that shows that, in fact, AZT is quite democratic. It kills all cells equally at the same rate. And, in fact, that means it kills healthy cells at a rate 1,000 times greater than they said it did.
Glaxo welcomes inserts to the physicians and the physician's desk reference, warns the doctors not to confuse the toxic effects of AZT with AIDS itself. AZT causes numerous AIDS-defining diseases. For example, AZT causes dementia, which is AIDS-defining, destroys the bone marrow, requiring life-saving blood transfusions of people that use AZT. This information you get from Glaxo Wellcome itself, the manufacturer.
They tested AZT, it failed, but what they said was, now wait a second, we know it works because the logic is correct. We've proven the logic. We simply have to work harder, do more experiments, but we will not give up the logic. So medicine's proof is the excellence of its explanations. The fact that it fails in tests is considered irrelevant because we know the explanations are correct.
So far, there have been no drugs that are effective, that don't have major side effects, that are affordable. But throw more money at us, and one of these days, maybe we'll come up with the vaccine or the drug or something that will cure this. But we're not making any promises. Don't ask us to promise that in 5 years we've actually made a difference with our drugs, because we can't possibly promise that.
What if you were to take a very healthy individual who had no risk factors for depressing their immune system, but every day, 4 times a day, you gave them one of the most toxic chemotherapy drugs ever created? AZT, what would you imagine would be the state of that person's immune system and overall health within 2 years? And yet that's exactly what has been done to countless individuals who have tested positive for the HIV antibody.
I initially was diagnosed in '89 and tested at a 900 level T4 count and was prescribed at that time AZT, which I took for a month and a half. And of course subsequently became very, very ill from it. And I decided in the meantime that as I was taking AZT to find out more about the drug, and as I learned it was extremely toxic, and I decided then to stop taking it and immediately got better. So at that point I had already had an early experience with the medical system and HIV treatment that had scared me and made me realize that they probably didn't know as much as they told me they knew about treatment.
They'll be taking the medications and they're looking gaunt, their skin's turning funny colors, they're real anemic, they're weak, sometimes coming in with canes. They do a little research on their own. We don't tell them what to do. We're about self-empowerment, self-responsibility, taking charge of your own life and health. They begin doing that, they get off the medications, color starts coming back, they start putting on the weight, they start feeling better. But there's a lapse, they get afraid again, they start taking the medications, we watch them start shrinking up again, they start looking gaunt, they start getting pale again, they start getting weak. Then they go, oh, maybe I should be doing this. They get off, they start coming back again. You actually watch this, and it's coordinated with taking these medications. It's just unmistakable.
To suggest that these drugs can be basically blamed for the symptoms of AIDS is lunacy, because these drugs, as I mentioned, only came along around 1987, 88, and lots of people died of AIDS before then. So you're going to have to explain, if you posit that antiretroviral drugs are the sole cause of AIDS itself, then you're going to have to explain how all the people who died, gross, disfiguring deaths before those drugs came along, what made them die.
AIDS in the 1980s was primarily the result of the recreational drug epidemic in the U.S. and in Europe. However, it shifted considerably in the 1990s. In the 1990s, at least half of all new AIDS cases, maybe even 60% now, are a direct result of the antiretroviral therapies themselves.
While the release of AZT in 1987 was not a cause of the 30 to 70 conditions considered to be the result of HIV infection, AZT certainly helped to hasten the deaths of countless individuals who were given the drug. And based upon my own research conducted within the fast-track gay community in New York City during the late 1970s and early 80s, there is no doubt in my mind that prior to the release of AZT in 1987, the development of the phenomena later identified as AIDS and the deaths of those individuals suffering from it were brought on in no small measure due to the hazardous lifestyles that they were living.
Protease inhibitors are medications that are very toxic. However, protease inhibitors have few good actions. They are antibiotic. So if the patient has an infection, it's going to work in the infection. They are antiparasite. If the patient has a parasite, it's going to be good for it. If the patient has a fungal disease is going to work also as an antimycotic. But beside that, the protease inhibitors are antioxidant. So at the beginning or for a while, the protease inhibitors are going to do good. However, in the long run, when we give to a patient protease inhibitors, we are blocking the metabolism or proteins all over the body. So in the long run, the patient is going to die. And this is why nowadays the HIV/AIDS establishment is still repeating, there is no cure for AIDS, there is no cure for AIDS, there is not a single cure for AIDS.
AIDS has continued to increase with antiviral drugs of the DNA chain terminator variety, and has decreased when recreational drug use decreased, and continued to decrease when the protease inhibitors were introduced in '97 because recreational drug use continued to decrease. But it didn't decrease as fast because people who are HIV positive are now being intoxicated, rendered AIDS patients by anti-HIV drugs.
The biggest reason for people who are HIV positive to die nowadays is liver failure. Liver failure is not an AIDS-defining condition. Liver failure is, however, a common side effect of AIDS drugs.
You have a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more people are treated against AIDS, the more people will eventually develop AIDS from it. And then the perfect excuse is delivered with the medication. You can say, Jesus, if I hadn't medicated you, you would have been sick even sooner and would have died sooner. But thanks to my medication, you are only getting sick now, and we're giving you even more medication. We need more money to develop further medications that have yet to cure the first AIDS patients.
Since the mid-1980s, on a regular basis, the headlines have touted amazing new promising drugs in the war on AIDS, the antiretroviral drugs. The trouble is, when you look back honestly, they didn't work, and tens of thousands of lives have been lost. Very few lives saved. These were not miracle breakthroughs that we were promised.
The miraculous protease inhibitor cocktails are a direct result of David Ho's work that he published in the scientific journal called Nature back in 1995. That paper in 1995 was the principal justification that the FDA used to release the protease inhibitors next year in 1996 for general use among the American public.
Dr. David Ho, named Time magazine's Man of the Year in 1996, was first to propose the dynamic nature of HIV replication in infected persons. According to Dr. Ho, when antiviral drugs were administered to an AIDS patient, replication of any new HIV would cease, and viral loads would decrease accordingly. However, the reality was, in a few days of administering these drugs, the remaining virus would mutate into a form resistant to drugs, and after several weeks the viral load would return to its pre-treatment levels. This paper was largely responsible for the advent of combination antiretroviral therapy, including the use of protease inhibitors.
In 1998, a group of researchers at University of California at Berkeley and the University of California at San Francisco joined forces to test David Ho's viral dynamics hypothesis. And in short, their results are that Ho's hypothesis is wrong. Heart actually does what HIV is supposed to be doing. It produces a shorter lifetime for the T cells in HIV-positive people taking the drugs as compared with HIV people who do not take the drugs.
And he came up with a completely new model of the virus, saying now we have not a slow virus, but we have a virus à grande vitesse, at high speed. And he was using Kermali's PCR technique, which is a multiplication technique, not a quantification technique, by the way. Even more, as those sequences he's going to multiply and equal them with the virus, that's the viral load, are present in everybody. And a new test where the pharmaceutical companies could make a great business out of it.
Invented by the AIDS dissident, Dr. Kary Mullis, PCR, the polymerase chain reaction, is a technique that enables a scientist to take a sample containing a minute amount of DNA and replicate that DNA sequence until there are 1 million copies. One of PCR's first applications was to try to detect HIV. According to Dr. Mullis, PCR amplifies whatever DNA is in a sample, regardless of whether that DNA belongs to HIV or a contaminant, and that there is no sure way to determine which part of the amplified material could be HIV and which part could be a contaminant. According to Dr. David Ho, viral load was measured when antiviral drugs were administered to a patient. These drugs were supposed to prevent replication of any new HIV, and viral load would decrease accordingly.
The pictures of HIV, the very few examples of electron microscope pictures of HIV were actually examples of culturing. They were created in the laboratory. There's no published picture of HIV from a blood sample, a tissue sample. You can't find HIV in humans. Even the manufacturer, on the front page, the third paragraph of the instructions, say do not use the viral load test to diagnose either AIDS or HIV. The PCR viral load test at best is looking at 3% of the genome of HIV. It's essentially looking at viral debris.
Viral load tests measure what's called HIV RNA. RNA is the part of the HIV virus that knows how to replicate itself. Scientists are able to identify HIV RNA in a person's blood, and by using the PCR method, the HIV RNA can be replicated in a laboratory test tube. The results of these tests are given as number of HIV RNA copies per milliliter of blood, similar to a T4 cell count.
The HIV genomes have been divided in many types. If all these were RNAs of a retrovirus, HIV, and if all the tests, the 3 tests, were measuring the viral load, then one would have expected all these numbers to be exactly the same. And yet, one can have, from no virus detected, no viral load at all, to up to 1 million.
The major proponents of the HIV hypothesis, Tom Merrigan at Stanford, Martin Markowitz, who works with David Ho at the Aaron Diamond, John Mellors at Pittsburgh. I've asked them, what does the viral load test have to do with infectious virus? Within a heartbeat, the answer is nothing. And the reason they have to say the viral load test has nothing to do with infectious virus is because that's what their own papers say themselves. The viral load test has nothing to do with infectious virus, and yet infectious virus is the only virus that causes disease.
Sex, blood, death, and numbers. That's an inescapably good combination to sell papers.
If they only have one microbe to warn you about, if there's one virus equals one disease, and there's one thing that you should do to prevent it, and that is to have safe sex or not share needles. That's a very easy message for the press to pick up on.
I certainly do believe that the media has a responsibility also. And that responsibility is to report fairly on all of the latest breakthroughs in whatever it may be it health, be it technologies, that the media has that responsibility.
Truth becomes lost in the glitter of one side and the apparent mundaneness of the other side.
As members of the Fifth Estate, the press has been vested with the public trust and has an obligation to report the truth. Has the media been laxed in its responsibility to fairly report all aspects, all views of the HIV/AIDS challenge? As journalists, there is a big responsibility. You need to consider how you cover a story, how you've been gathering information, the reliability of your sources. There is a need to see both sides of an issue impartially. Unfortunately, all too often, journalists are hampered by the thought of losing their jobs or simply not being published because of the controversial nature of their findings.
When I was first reporting on the views of scientists who challenged the HIV story, I really thought that my colleagues would be quick to pick up and look at this themselves too soon. And I was amazed that instead of doing that, they not only ignored the critique, but they actually attacked me and the Sunday Times for having raised these issues, that this whole thing is a kind of house of cards. It's an illusory thing where our good feelings, allied with greed and ambition and things like that, but primarily often our good feelings have led us into a huge trap where an unvalidated theory has been marketed to the world and today is causing untold harm.
The Journal of the American Medical Association, the British Medical Journal, The Lancet, Nature, and the New England Journal of Medicine, the 5 most respected medical journals in the world, will not allow dissonant views on the cause or treatment of AIDS. How then does one encourage the dialogue to challenge the orthodoxy? The 5 major medical publications in the world will not allow dissonant views on the cause or treatment of AIDS or any information around it. How then are you going to encourage a dialogue that could challenge the orthodoxy?
The two main aspects of the hypothesis are that AIDS is caused exclusively and finally by HIV, and secondly, that this is universally infectious and will cause a pandemic by heterosexual transmission in the general population. Now, the Lancet has published some stuff, mainly by me, in the form of letters, which cast doubt on those two essential pillars of the hypothesis. They haven't published much else, and the other journals have published nothing at all. They've been asked to do so again and again by myself and others.
Reporters came, asked these questions, and found them, my views or my hypotheses, very logical and convincing. But they never aired them because they were censored at the highest level, presumably when an executive producer would have called the National Institute of Health, is it all right to show this view, advanced by Duisberg from Berkeley.
I submitted a manuscript to journal, Nature's and others, to publish my finding and to publish the impact of medication and the corticosteroid on the influence on the AIDS epidemics. And I am a pathologist and toxicologist, but they rejected the articles. The main Journal of Immunology, New England journals, and Nature's and Science, they are publishing only one side of view.
There must be someone who has the authority, who has the ear of the media, who will sit down with a group of the leading scientists, including a number of Nobel Prize winners, who have this different perspective of HIV/AIDS, who know of the problems of the HIV paradigm. There is a need to sit down with these people and to hear what they have to say.
We have had great difficulty with a fairly short paper based entirely on data in the UK and USA, all verifiable, all factual, and coming from an immense and well-validated database in both countries. We cannot get that published. It's only 4,000 words. We cannot get it published. We sent it to the BMJ, the Lancet, the New England Journal of Medicine, the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine, and we've discussed it in other quarters, and they will not only not publish it, they will not give reasons for not publishing it, and they did not subject it to peer review. Now, I think, Gary, you should get those editors and ask them all individually to give you the reasons.
In fact, the World Health Organization accused me personally, when I was writing on these articles, of being responsible for millions more projected deaths. Millions more projected deaths. In the UK, definitely, and, worldwide. They were saying, by raising these issues in an important paper like the Sunday Times, you will be doing so much damage to our efforts to tell people about this peril that is awaiting. And they would believe this when they were saying it. I can't think of another national newspaper, any other national newspaper, that came to the support of the Sunday Times when it was doing this. All the medical and science correspondents were united in either being silent on the issue, or else they would be ready to join in with others in attacking the Sunday Times and accusing it of irresponsibility.
Censorship in the gay press is a tragedy, a disgrace. It's been almost complete. There are people in this city who work quite hard to try and create the space in which a proper discussion can be had.
AIDS was subsequently cooked up in 1981-82 to explain why certain groups of people were ill. But nobody seemed to ask the one simple question: are we absolutely sure that all these so-called high-risk groups of people would have been perfectly well without HIV? And the answer to that has to be no.
As I continued to work the issue as a journalist, I gradually became more and more skeptical. At the same time, I was also involved in AIDS activism and could see how the organizations changed over the years. Activists who were concerned about finding a solution to AIDS would grab onto, they would be interested, as I attempted to share my growing doubts about the HIV/AIDS model. And instead, I saw people clinging to HIV with an almost religious fervor.
It's become very difficult for gay media to promote a perspective which is not dependent on the HIV causes AIDS hypothesis, because if they did, they'd risk losing all their funding and going out of business. It's a kind of commercial reality, if you like. One of the things I found very surprising is the degree to which science journalists have just followed the medical industry line and not seriously challenged it to a large extent. For example, I had an African journalist staying with me, and he turned around and said to me, if what you're saying is true, then surely other well-known journalists would have been talking about it by now. Well, it just so happened that I had within arm's reach Neville Hodgkinson's AIDS, the Failure of Contemporary Science. Neville Hodgkinson, of course, being a former Sunday Times science writer. So I reached out and showed it to him, and he just didn't want to know. And that seems to be a widespread phenomenon in the media. They just don't want to know. And I find that astonishing from a profession which is supposed to be truth-seeking.
It's anathema, it shouldn't ever be mentioned. If the great and the good say this is so, it must be so because everybody says so. But, so therefore, there's bound to be some form of censorship.
And whenever I or anyone else raises the argument that we should start looking at the alternative views, we're immediately told that we're being highly irresponsible, that we're encouraging the gay community into things like unsafe sex, and we're being completely and utterly disregarding the anxieties of people who have HIV and AIDS, because we're creating doubts and anxieties that they don't need. And this is quite wrong, because as a journalist, I believe in totally open debate in whatever the area should be.
Truth is simple. Truth is ordinary. Thomas Jefferson said he could not believe any matter of the conduct of our life could be a matter of science, because he says for every man of science there are thousands who are not. What would become of them? Here are the thousands who are not. And I agree with Thomas Jefferson. The truth about the conduct of life is simple, is ordinary. It is about you and I, ordinary people, living our lives in good and helpful ways. But that lacks glamour, it lacks newsworthiness.
And the truth is that if you're a journalist who says, I'm going to report the truth in today's market where a few very powerful people control the media outlets in most countries, you'll lose your job.
Anyone who tries to venture into this field of trying to report fairly and accurately all sides of the story will immediately be pushed out onto the margins and told that they're being irresponsible and that they are trying to support people whose views are just not credible and they're nutters. And so the journalists themselves will then become treated as nutters and as rogues. And so they begin to lose their credibility. And so it's a very brave journalist who puts forward any of these views, because immediately he's in danger of having his whole journalistic career discredited.
One of the best defenses of the AIDS establishment is telling you that it's far too complex for you to understand. You can't possibly understand it. Don't try, just trust us. And that has been very successful so far. At some point in time, and I hope it's not in the too distant future, we will be looking back on AIDS and saying, how could we have been bamboozled for so long? How come nobody spoke up?
The current generation have too much to lose of orthodoxy, of journalists. They've invested their lives in trying to be helpful to the AIDS debate. They think that their journalism is helping. In actual fact, it's based on a false premise. Now, they're not going to backtrack. Neither the journalists nor the scientists. Nobody's going to backtrack. There's too much to lose.
Either they cover it with ridicule, or they don't even mention it at all, because they seem to think that would mislead the public, give them a false impression, might make them more relaxed about having safe sex, etc.
And so there's a kind of absence of skepticism, an absence of critical thinking, which in part has explained how AIDS has been able to be interpreted only one single way, which is it's caused by a virus. Sexual behavior is at the root of it. Changing your sexual behavior is what will make you free of AIDS.
Africa is a country where they say everyone has so much sex all the time, that they're spreading this virus terribly, and that the lorry drivers are spreading it up and down the big highways.
Malaria, malnutrition, the lack of elementary facilities, the abuse of women, the neglect of children. All of those things conspire towards creating what appears to be registrations of a huge pandemic.
Poverty is the main factor of AIDS in Africa, which is not the case, of course, in the States or in Europe.
Weight loss of greater than 10% of your body weight, chronic diarrhea, a persistent fever and cough.
By that definition, a Western researcher like myself has had AIDS.
The test picked up immune system activation from this great variety of causes. People were testing positive in millions who had nothing to do with any new disease agent.
In Africa, what's called AIDS is simply relabeling other diseases. People are ill from malnutrition, which causes immune deficiency, malaria, which causes immune deficiency, TB, which affects your immune system.
Since you have two things going on with tuberculosis, number one, it cross-reacts on the HIV antibody tests, and number two, it can cause T-cell depletion all by itself, then you've got a big problem in Africa. Do these people have AIDS or do they have tuberculosis?
What AIDS has become in Africa is a great distraction. It distracts us from the questions of better foods, clean drinking water, more appropriate ways to dispose of toxic waste, and it puts the burden back on Africans and their alleged promiscuous sexual activity.
Is it because of their sexual behavior? Absolutely not.
A definition was arrived at as a result of a World Health Organization sponsored conference in October of 1985. The Bangui definition of an AIDS case in Africa is based on 4 clinical symptoms: high fever, a persistent cough, loose stools for 30 days, and a 10% loss of body weight over a 2-month period.
Any person with severe starvation has AIDS regardless of HIV positive or HIV negatives, because starvation causes atrophy of the lymphoid system.
But instead of giving these people clean water, nutritious and adequate food, what do they need? Well, they need condoms, and they need expensive and toxic drugs.
It's a tangled web of madness. By calling all those things AIDS, by just making it more and more and more complicated to figure out what causes what. See, it's like, that's not the way science works. It's a real bizarre thing to have 100,000 people being paid to do something that strange, to take a whole bunch of diseases, to lump them all into this one big thing. This great, I mean, pretty soon, there won't be anything that's not AIDS. If they keep going at the rate they're going, you say, well, let's see what will happen in 100 years. How many diseases will be on that list?
Among people who are well-to-do or middle class, if you have the symptoms that define an AIDS case, you have a wealthy or wealthier middle-class African businessman or professional, or an Indian, an Asian, or a European who has a high fever or a persistent cough or diarrhea or is losing weight, those people by definition are going to go to a doctor. They're going to seek out medical treatment. But in the case of impoverished Africans, it is assumed that these symptoms have come about because of their sexuality, because of their sexual behavior.
Africa is always described as the place where, because 50% of the HIV cases are in women, that heterosexual spread is to blame. It's all wrong. And it is not only wrong, it is a crime to do this to that continent and to those people.
Much of what is claimed about AIDS in Africa is not only based on weak statistics and dubious numbers, it's also based on a kind of racist, arrogant set of assumptions that were popular 100 years ago, but now have been brought back into vogue.
The claims often made by AIDS researchers about African sexuality take us back to the 19th century. They take us back to the Victorians. They take us back to old National Geographics from 70 years ago with the strange sexual customs of the natives kind of thinking.
What is the benefit of all the billions upon billions of dollars that are spent fighting the so-called African AIDS crisis? Many believe that money could have been much better spent elsewhere.
A question comes up about what happens to patients in clinics around Africa. Doctors find themselves short of basic medication. They find them short of staff. They find that their budgets have been savaged over the last 15 or 20 years, but there is plenty of money to distribute AIDS literature, condoms, and most damagingly, in my mind, so-called AIDS medications.
It's very hard for people in Africa to turn down foreign currency, big grants of foreign currency, to reject the paradigm that money is coming for, of promoting the HIV/AIDS theory, even if their heart tells them that it's wrong. Very hard for them to speak out against it when they can earn more from attending some conference on AIDS than they get paid by their government in a year, which is the case in a number of African countries.
The money in Africa is riding on a large number of people being diagnosed with HIV and AIDS. All of the organizations in Africa that have money are associated with AIDS.
If someone came along and told them there is no AIDS, all there is the same diseases that Africans have been dying of all along, then all of a sudden millions of dollars of funding would dry up.
In 1988, Dr. Philip Kreinen and his wife trained in tropical medicines before moving to Africa to help AIDS orphans. They were told that this was an epicenter of AIDS in Africa, where more than 50% of people had HIV and AIDS. But upon arrival, they did preliminary testing and found that only 13% of the population tested positive, not 50%. Shortly thereafter, they did more definitive testing and found that the number fell below 5%.
It is the first time in Africa that a village has volunteered as a whole to be tested for a dreadful disease, that everybody has got its results, and that the truth has been 5 times lower than the figures given by the World Health Organization or the AIDS control program.
When a person had tested HIV positive, he would give them support, nutritional support, help with housing, help with drugs for the illnesses that they actually suffered, like it might be TB or intestinal infections. He would give them direct help for what might otherwise have been called AIDS. But he would give them the medicines appropriate to their actual diseases, and he would give them nutritional support. And he found that these people, after a period of support like this, had lower death rates. This is the people who tested positive and who his charity was set up to help.
Because of AIDS, with the diseases which are called AIDS here, which are similar to the symptoms of AIDS, they are less and less since now 2 years.
He ended up by saying, you know, Neville, after 5 years we've concluded that there's no AIDS and no AIDS orphans. And since that time, he's had a policy that his charity and the regions that it serves have completely renounced the HIV/AIDS story altogether. They just have nothing more to do with it because they think it does such harm.
How can you ask people who believe they're going to die tomorrow, how can you ask them to look into the future, which are the children? They give up. They don't invest. They don't want to come to work in northern Kagera because they think they are going to die of AIDS or to contract it.
The World Health Organization claims that 10 million HIV-positive Africans are responsible for 300,000 cases of AIDS reported since 1981. Unlike in developed countries, where over 90% of the AIDS cases are promiscuous homosexual males, intravenous drug users, and blood transfusion recipients, African AIDS is supposedly suffered by men and women in equal numbers, who contract it presumably through heterosexual intercourse. The African figures are often cited by the AIDS establishment and safe-sex activists in Europe and the United States to prove that everybody is at equal risk.
This has become a calling. This has become a kind of endeavor fighting AIDS, in which people who believe in what they're doing cannot, in good conscience, hold a contrary thought. It's what psychologists call the mentality of taboo. Holding a critical thought, if you are in the AIDS orthodoxy, is against the rules. It's a taboo because it means, or it suggests to mean, that you are turning your back on the people that you are supposed to be helping. The cure for AIDS in Africa is as near at hand as an alternative hypothesis as to what is making Africans sick in the first place. And that is what I strongly recommend people do before giving any more money to these AIDS organizations.
If you ask me, are people sicker today than they were 30 years ago? I would answer you based upon my knowledge of what is taking place in Samoa, Ethiopia, Kenya, Senegal, South Africa, the massive civil wars that have occurred, the starvation, the enormous refugee camps, the malaria and tuberculosis that goes virtually untreated. Yes, there is no doubt in my mind that people are sicker in Africa and living shorter lifespans. When people get an AIDS diagnosis based upon clinical testing, they return to their villages to die. They basically give up all hope. They lose their will to live. They become outcast. They're rejected by their extended family, forced to live in a secluded, segregated little hut where they are given only meager amounts of food and water and prepare themselves for death.
What people don't realize about Africa is that life expectancy there has never been particularly long. To think that the arrival, shall we say, of HIV or AIDS in Africa has suddenly started shortening life expectancy in African countries is really contradicted by the evidence.
The media reports that 1,000 people a day die of AIDS in South Africa. It is a number with no statistical grounding, no evidentiary basis whatsoever. It is simply something repeated in the media. But if one goes and checks that number against the actual official statistics of South Africa, what you will discover is in 2004, in South Africa, a country of 46 million people, the total number of deaths that were attributable to HIV diseases was about 13,000. That's about 36 a day.
There has been a lot of death and disease and AIDS in Africa for many centuries. And again, our clinical tools and Western medicine penetrating some of these more remote corners of the world has allowed us to define a phenomenon that may well have been there for a very, very long time.
There was a study in the Journal of Infectious Diseases in 1994, for example, that made it quite clear that when they did these HIV tests on a population in Zaire, where there was widespread tuberculosis and leprosy, that the test results in 70% of the cases were false positive. If the test results are 2 or 3% false positive, a test is basically invalid. It's useless in terms of epidemiology. Usually these tests are conducted at a sexually transmitted disease clinic. Maybe 100 or 200 people are tested, or they're done at an antenatal clinic where pregnant women are also tested. And from those samples, then projections are made about the rate of HIV/AIDS.
The infrastructure, social and medical, is non-existent. Post-colonially, over all these 20 to 30 years now, 40, the services have disappeared. Malaria control, TB control. In areas like the Rakai in Uganda, there is no water that's clean. The pathogenic assault, the toxic assault of filthy water, malaria 11 times before you're 7 years old, diarrhea 7 times before you're 1 year old, makes your immune system very, very at risk and depressed. And if you test people with a severely challenged immune system, it is likely, according to the work of Professor Hessig and Eleni Eliopoulos now in Perth, that you will show antibodies that come up from the stress. And these antibodies are being called specific to HIV and are being called infected by HIV. I don't believe that. I believe they are autoantibodies that are developed as a result of your body's immune stress.
One of the reasons that HIV is thought to be new in Africa is we have blood samples from the 60s that show no evidence of HIV. But the one question that journalists haven't answered is where that blood came from. And if you look carefully, it did not come from the same risk groups that we are now drawing blood from today and finding lots of HIV. It came from British school children in Uganda in a sort of the colonial time when Dutch and French and Brits were colonizing Africa.
If we're really honest, we would go back and we would do much more retrospective analysis, even go back 100 years, to find embalmed tissue, embalmed organs, and test them for HIV, and I think we'd be very surprised by what we would find. I believe we would find that both HIV and the group of infections known as AIDS are old phenomena found all over the world. Based upon my 25 years of research and massive interviewing, more than 3,000 physicians, scientists, experts, and activists on the subject of AIDS and AIDS-related illnesses, particularly how it was affecting Africans, there appears to be only one startling conclusion that I can reasonably come to, and that is, AIDS is not about a virus. No, it is about the untreated underlying diseases such as malaria, tuberculosis, malnutrition, and waterborne illnesses including diarrhea and parasitic infections. It is about living in dire poverty and conditions of chronic civil war. It is about suffering the lethal effects of the AIDS diagnosis itself, including the harmful drugs that are prescribed in clinic after clinic where AIDS individuals are provided, however, with good nutrition and clean water and proper medications for underlying illnesses such as malaria. The vast majority of individuals return to proper health. But when AIDS individuals are severely compromised in their immune systems and are given the most lethal medications ever created, they do get sicker and they die. But their deaths and illnesses are then blamed on the HIV virus instead of the real illnesses underlying their AIDS conditions. More and more experts are agreeing on this view of AIDS. And yet, this view has been suppressed as contrary to the financial interest of the AIDS establishment and its drug manufacturers. Isn't it time that we take a closer, unbiased look at AIDS in Africa and its real causes and real solutions?
It's not possible in the limitations of this program to bring you everything about AIDS, but I'm hopeful that this at least gave you a second opinion, opened you up to a very controversial issue, and let you know that there are a lot of voices that should be heard, issues explored. And that is our intent. Thank you very much for watching.